Well, good morning. My name is Jeff Ramsey, and I live here in Orlando volunteering with the conference. And on behalf of SHRM, I would like to welcome you to this session entitled The 6 Elements of Strategic Thinking, a Common Framework for Developing Strategic Leaders. As a courtesy to the speaker and your fellow attendees, please make sure that your cell phones are silenced. There are no paper evaluations for this session, so evaluations for this session will be completed through the mobile app. Click on the evaluations icon on the app homepage to access the list of sessions that will be evaluated electronically. Your participation in SHRM's evaluation process is appreciated and greatly valued. Now, on behalf of SHRM, I am pleased to introduce our speaker for this session, John Austin. John Austin, an award-winning researcher and engaging teacher, is fascinated by the different ways that people react to and inspire change. I've begun to see that it isn't about charisma, but about process and perseverance. As a principal in executive development, he explores a fundamental question: how do great leaders catalyze transformation? John has worked with leaders across industries. His client list include Hewlett-Packard, General Electric, Merck, the U.S. National Park Service, Nokia, HSBC, Pfizer, and the University of Pennsylvania. So please join me in welcoming John.
Thank you very much, and I thank all of you for agreeing to close out this excellent conference with me. So we know from the recency effect, right, that there is a good chance that you'll remember something I say as the last person who gets to talk to you. So my hope is that you remember something useful, not something goofy that I say, I suppose. So when you hear my background, and when you hear anyone's background, it sounds, all nice and all. And sure, I'm a principal in executive development. I like to refer to myself also as a recovering academic. For many years, I was a management professor, and I found that I was much more interested in engaging directly with managers and executives. But for the next hour and 15 minutes or so, what I'd like to do is I'd like to hopefully, if I accomplish my objective, give you some way to start thinking through all of that information that has hit you this week, some way to at least categorize it. And if you leave this hour with at least 1 or 2 interesting questions that you don't often ask of others, I think that will be very valuable, okay? And the other thing that I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to challenge all of you to kind of think about what is it that makes it difficult for us to be strategic thinkers. And we do know quite a bit about this. What this also means, though, is that I am going to ask you to trust me in some things. And we know that in order to trust someone, you have to know them. And none of you really know me very well. So I'm going to do something to get you all to trust me a little bit, okay? Here's, when you think about when you meet someone new. So you're standing next to someone in line, say for a Tim McGraw concert, okay? Or any sort of conference or a party, whatever it is, you find yourself standing next to someone, so you have to talk with them. You don't really know whether you trust that person, whether you like that person, so you just randomly talk about things, right? So we toss out things about the weather. We don't really care about the weather, but it's a safe thing to say. And then suddenly, you hit upon something that you both have in common. Oh, hey, I was in Alaska. How long were you in Alaska? And we exchange a couple stories about that. And what happens at that moment? The energy goes up, right? And you may lean in a little bit. You start to find this connection with the person. And if this connection continues, that's when we get some level of trust, right? So don't have time to do that with all of you scattered strategically, I've noticed, across a 2,500 seat room, so that there's no way I can connect with all of you. But here's what I will do. I'm going to tell you a couple random things about my past, and for those of you who have some connection with that, you will then be able to trust me and you will vouch for me to the people sitting around you, okay? Because that's how it's going to work, okay? So, easy thing to start with is universities, because I've been involved with a number of them in my career. So I'm just going to list the universities I've had some connections with and see who I can get in the audience to vouch for me as we move forward over the next hour, okay? So I was an undergraduate, got a degree in economics from Johns Hopkins University. Then we'll raise our hands if we have connections on these things. I went to graduate school at Boston College, got a PhD in organization studies there. Then I was a faculty member at University of Washington, was a faculty member at Penn State University. Okay, yep, so I'm getting some more here. And then if you notice that trajectory, it's towards more increasingly serious football schools. Okay, and I wasn't sure where to go next, so I was getting a little antsy. So that's when I left the academic world and joined DSI. But I have then also taught executives at University of Pennsylvania, Wharton, and Georgetown University. Okay, so just anyone who's got a connection with any of those, just raise your hands. Okay, fantastic. That's enough. You're strategically placed. You are now going to be my surrogate and vouch for me. Okay, so there we go. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's move forward here and talk just a little bit about strategic thinking. The first thing, though, I of course want to call your attention to, if you're on Twitter, feel free to track me down. I wanted to point this out because what you have for me in your program is my company, which is Decision Strat, but feel free to also connect with me on Triple Translate, which is my personal Twitter account. And at this moment right now, you can feel free to Twitter your friends and mock them for leaving the conference early, because this is the best session ever. It doesn't have to be actually any good. You just have to get them to think that they missed something, and you win. Okay? All right. So when we think about strategic thinking, let me just point out that for a number of years I've worked in this area of strategic thinking, mostly as it relates to helping companies and leaders make better strategic decisions and how we engage and enact change. So those are the two areas that my background is in. And I kept getting the same statement back, which is, you know, John, we need people to be better strategic thinkers. And it turns out no one really was clear what they meant by that. And it just seemed like you probably hear this a lot in HR, which is people coming to you and saying, we just need our executives to be better strategic thinkers. So myself and my colleagues sat down and we actually really talked about what's out there. What do we know? What does the research tell us strategic thinkers do better when we define, we sort of approach people and ask them to define this and think about what are those behaviors. And the result of this was initially a model of 6 buckets of behaviors. We can think of these as the disciplines of strategic thinking. And what we found was that people who are identified within their organizations as being the best strategic thinkers in their organizations, they do all 6 of these things. They do some behaviors that others see in each one of these areas. And it looks rather intuitive when you look at this. And the key thing I want to point out to you is that we find that those that are more successful as strategic thinkers and are viewed as the strategic leaders over their organizations do each one of these. It's not a pick and choose. Every job in your organization does not require all 6 of these. So this is a very important way to make the distinction between the person and the job, because increasingly what we're finding is regardless of what a person's job is, if they are good at all of these dimensions and are aware of them, they can excel within that organization, that they can move out of one job to another job. And we're starting to see more interesting work in that area as well. So what I'd like to spend the next little while with you to talk about is for each one of these dimensions, I'm going to just very quickly illustrate why it's hard to do. What is it that prevents us from doing it? There is a very big knowing-doing gap with each of these dimensions. And I'd like to point out why that is. And there's a good reason for that. My background's in cognitive science, and I think you'll see a lot of that come out in my arguments here. I'm then going to highlight for each one of them some very small thing that you can do to enable that discipline. And it's something for you to think about both in your job, but also to think about how you can enable this within your team, and how, as as someone who is within the HR area of your organization, you can enable this with your leaders of your organization. So, very quickly, what are these 6 things? I'm going to start with anticipate, and just very quickly mention what they are, and then dig a little deeper into each one. Anticipate really is just like it sounds like. It's actually expecting when the world is going to change. So it's not just following trends, it's actually actively looking for how the trends are going to shift, looking for those uncertainties and really staying in front of those and trying to be proactive. Challenging is just what it sounds like. It's actually challenging conventional wisdom, pushing people to really think about whether they're solving the right problem, thinking about alternate ways of viewing decisions. With interpret, we're talking about how you bring information in, and the successful strategic leaders we find really think carefully about the biases that are there and how we bring information in. And with decide, it's really just what it sounds like. It's working with being very good at knowing when it's time to decide, having multiple good options to work with, and also knowing how to bring other people into the decision process and having a good system for doing that. With aligning, we're now talking more internal to the organization. That is, this is where what we find is that this is an awareness of who the stakeholders are. This is also an awareness of what are all the other initiatives that are going on and how your initiative fits within it. And then finally with learn, we improve each time. We have some mechanism to assess how we've done things and how we can do it better in the future. Now, I'm going to go through each one. All I'm going to do is highlight one reason that it's a problem, why it's challenging to do. I'm going to highlight the one that I found to be the most in your face, and the thing that each of us can really work with differently. We're going to do this in a somewhat interactive way. And before I do that, though, I just want a quick show of hands on this. If you look at these 6 dimensions, here's your test. Which of these dimensions do you think, as a profession, HR professionals are strongest at? And as a profession, which of these dimensions are HR professionals weakest at? Okay? So just pick one of those. Let's just start. I'm going to rattle off the 6, and I want you to raise your hand if you think that's what we're strongest at. Okay? Okay, who would say we're strongest at anticipating? Okay, all right. Challenging. Interpreting. Deciding. Aligning. Learning. Very good. Okay, interesting. Now, I'll give you the answer in a second, but first I want the other side. Okay? Which one would you say we're the weakest at? So, anticipating. Challenging. Interpreting. Deciding. Aligning. Learning. Okay, interesting. Okay, so what we get is most people went with anticipate on the second one that we're worst at with that. There was kind of a range. A lot of you said interpret for what we're best at. I will tell you that what we've seen is that, yes, interpreting, the focusing on bringing the right data in is a strength of HR. There's a second real strong strength of HR, and it's aligning. You are in the position to bring people together and to connect things in an organization, and we see that with a lot of HR leaders. You nailed it on where's the weakness. It's in anticipating. The good news is that, I don't know if it's good news, it's the weakness across the board with executives. It's either on the both ends. It's the anticipating and it's the learning of this. And that makes an awful lot of sense in some ways because those are the two things that do not often have deadlines. They do not have short-term deliverables off of them. And so they're the things that are easiest to put aside as you put out all of your fires. Okay? All right, so as we go forward with this, we're going to start with anticipate, and I'm going to highlight just a couple key things about each one. So first, I'm going to give you a 20-minute warning about something, though. In about 20 minutes, I'm going to give you an exercise where I'm going to ask you to write some things down on a sheet of paper. Okay? I don't hand you any paper, though. Okay, so you have 20 minutes to think about what random piece of paper you have on your person that you can use to write some notes on. Okay, and I'll let you ponder that. Don't worry, it's not going to go on your permanent record. No one will see it but you. You can write on whatever you want. Okay, so to start with anticipate. I want you to, I'm going to show you a picture here. I want you to raise your hand if you know what city this is a picture of. Okay, don't shout it out. Just raise your hand. Okay. Whoops, I'm sorry. This was in here. It's my reminder. I put a slide in here. There's a lot of words on it. I don't expect you to read it. Really, all this is that what I want to remind you of is that I have included at the end of the presentation that's available to you online some detailed slides that give you the descriptions and what we know about each of these 6 dimensions, because this is not a presentation where I'm walking through slides, but I want you to have that available. So if you go online and get this presentation, there's an appendix with more details about each one of these things. Okay? The other thing to point out from here is that we do actually have an assessment which we use along each of these dimensions, and you'll get some of the details of that in the appendix as well. Okay? So now, all right, back to where I was. Let's take a look at what city is this? Okay, just raise your hand if you know what city that is. Okay, don't see many hands. I'm going to show you another picture. Tell me if you know what city it is. What city is that? Okay, I've got one hand up, I think. I don't know if I saw any hands for that first one. All right. Anyone else? Raise your hand if now you know what city this is. Okay, a few more hands up. Okay, raise your hand if you know what city this is. All right, fantastic. It's London. All right, now, here's the thing about that. So the thing with anticipate is we have to have the right scope to get the information to us, right? And the punchline with this is that within our organization, we have different people with different scopes to their job. And our hope is that if we combine them together, we all figure out what's actually going on. And we see the weak signals that are coming into us that the industry world is changing. The problem is these first 2 do not equal the third. Okay? That even if I have someone in my organization that's got the big picture out there, and I've got a bunch of people that have this small picture, that doesn't mean they're going to figure out the picture they need to figure out what's going on. Okay? And the biggest challenge we have when it comes to anticipating is that we don't look in the right place. And if we think about that, the best way to really find out new information is to look in different places than you normally look. And to not look at the same things that everyone in your industry looks at, everyone in your organization looks at. So there are resources out there for us. Things such as future scenario reports. I know the SHRM Foundation is they periodically put out their trends report, trends in work, trends in the workplace. Those types of resources are the types of things that can give you some insight here. And the key is, who are those people? What are the questions you're going to ask them to get at that? I think about this as, if you think about how good your organization is at looking for the weak signals, those things that are at the edges, you can also think about, is it at the right level for the amount of uncertainty that's out there in the environment? And so, for example here, if I have low skill at this in my organization, and I have a high amount of volatility out there, we would say, of course, that you're myopic. You're sort of focused in too much, and you're vulnerable to change in your industry. Then, ideally, we're aligned. If I have a lot of variability out there, I also am able to bring in a lot of information. And then, of course, we have, well, I don't have a lot of change in my environment, so I don't need this. Well, perhaps that's focused. And then there's that situation where I see everything, I'm monitoring all those weak signals, but there's really not much change going on in my industry. So that might be a lack of focus. I'm sort of neurotic about these things, chasing the lights and the shiny things that are out there. I would challenge you, though, that what we see right now is there are very increasingly fewer and fewer industries that would say they're not facing some sort of transformational change. So our goal is to try to get up and out of that tunnel vision. How many of you have seen that viral video that's been around since 1999 about the basketball team and the gorilla? The gorilla that walks across while you're counting basketballs. How many of you, just raise your hand? I thought so, right? So, that's a great example, right, about how if we're all looking at the same thing, we're all looking at the basketball, no one sees the gorilla that's walking across the video there. And you could say, I don't need to see the gorilla because my job was counting passes and I got the right number. Well, how about someone else in your organization? They might need to see that gorilla, know that there's a gorilla walking around. One of the things that I do when I lead change teams is I always, we're good with managing teams. What is one of the things we do? We always walk through and assign each person a deliverable in our team. That sounds great. The next week, everyone reports on their deliverable. I actually try, when I'm leading one of these change teams, to have one person who doesn't have a deliverable. And what their job is to simply look around them and see what's going on. They view it as sort of something that relaxes them. But in reality, we give them the first 5 minutes of the next meeting, and they tend to take it seriously. And they say, here's what's going on in the world that is changing, and that is important to our product, our project. So that's one strategy you can use to sort of embed this. The other is to think about who are you asking and what are the questions you're asking. Often we ask questions about what are the threats that are out there. And that's useful to know. But I've recently really become aware of the value of that positive question as well. One of the best positive questions that I've recently started experimenting with is that simple question, what's the best thing that's happened to you? And this was something that was given to me as from what's her name? Robin, she's Appreciative Inquiry. Anyone? No, not Robin Roberts, but that's a good guess based on this week, right? Robin Burton. Oh, it's right there. It's going to pop out in the middle of my conversation in about 30 minutes. You know how that is? She's done a lot of work in appreciative inquiry, and she's the one who sort of really triggered this idea of what's the most interesting thing that's happened to you, and what's the best thing that happened to you. And you often get something unique and insightful in that question. So one quick question for you before we move on with this, and I'm going to actually move a bit quicker through the other items here, okay? The question is, over the last few days, you've heard a lot of different things from a lot of very thoughtful people. I'm curious, what's a weak signal that has popped up? Anyone want to shout out a weak signal? Something that suggests just on the edge that the world is changing? Anything? I heard something way in the back. What? Types of jobs. Okay, a shift in the types of jobs. That's a type of weak signal. Okay. Anything else? Okay, just the pace of change. Okay, that type of thing is out there. And I challenge you as you go home to think about what is the real weak signal, right, that has stuck with you throughout this day or throughout the last few days. Okay, let's shift to something else now, though. I want to give you an opportunity. I know that the SHRM is going to be in Las Vegas next year, so you maybe want to start practicing your work with cards. So I'm going to show you some playing cards here. I want you to look up at the screen, and I just want you to tell me what the 3 playing cards are. Okay? So, just going to show it up there for about a second or two. All right. Okay, what was the third card? Just everyone shout it out. 10 of diamonds. What was the second card? King of clubs. What was the first card? Jack of hearts. Okay, so we got 10 of diamonds, king of clubs, jack of hearts. Okay, we got no. Some people saw something else. Okay, how many of you, let's just show of hands here. How many of you saw 10 of diamonds? Last card. How many of you saw a king of clubs? How many of you saw a jack of hearts? Okay, so majority is that's what we got, but we've got some disagreement, it seems, here. So let's take a look here. 10 of diamonds, king of clubs, jack of... Oh, it's a red spade. John, you tricked me. There's no such card as that, right? So, first of all, many of you probably saw this as a spade. Show of hands, how many of you saw this as a spade? Keep your hands up for a moment. Tell me how many of you got through all 3 cards? That's pretty good. Actually, a number of you did that. That's fantastic, because one of the things that we find is that if you see this as a spade, it slows you down. And that actually suggests why it is that we see it as a heart. We see it as a heart because it's easier to see it as a heart, and because that's what our experience tells us it is. You did not see these cards as they were. You saw these cards as your experience told you they were. And I want you to understand then that I did not trick you here. That's not a heart. We have to agree that's not a heart, or I can't make my point here, okay? And as long as you recognize it's not a heart, you have to recognize that you tricked yourself, right? And it is that you understand what cards look like that makes you see this as a heart. And this is actually why we have problem challenging. We talk about how we need people to challenge conventional wisdom, challenge the question, make sure we're solving the right problem. Well, it's real easy to say, but if you don't even recognize that there's another way to see things, it's very hard to challenge. And unfortunately, this happens automatically for us, that our experience really drives us to see things a certain way. This is also why we say those people who've been in an industry or in a job for so long, sometimes maybe the last people to see a change. That doesn't mean that's a bad thing. It means that we need to make sure those people have the skill to be able to take the expertise that they've gained over all those years and combine it with the inquiry that will allow them to see how things are different. And what we find that strategic leaders do is they don't ask the question when they walk into a room, how is this similar? They ask the question, how is this different than anything I've seen before? And that's one of the key things we need for challenge. Okay, so our problem with challenge is we don't see our frames. And to point that out one other way, you remember this image. I use this purposely because it's been in every social psychology textbook since probably the 50s, okay? And this is an image that's the old woman and the young woman. And you've seen it perhaps dozens of times. It's both an old woman and it's a young woman. Whichever one you see first, you see quickly, as soon as it's flashed up there. The interesting thing is that it's hard to see the second one. Even if you've seen this hundreds of times, it takes a moment for you to see that the old woman or the young woman. However, notice right now, looking at this, for those of you who've now seen both of these, notice how easy it is to now flip back and forth. That's the key here, is that the first reframing is the hard one, where you need to work at it. You need some sort of a system to get you to redefine a problem. Once you've done it once, it's very easy, and you flip back and forth very easily. And so one of the things that we work with strategic leaders is to think of how someone else would see this issue. What is a different framing of this issue? How would your customer define this issue? How would someone in the finance side of your organization see this issue? How would your suppliers see it? How would your competitors see it? Once you've recognized that someone else might define that problem differently, it becomes very easy to switch back and forth. And we find that strategic leaders actually build this into their process of how they talk to people. They ask the questions to get different frames of reference out there. Okay? So we're on to challenge here, and the big problem we have with challenge is it's easy to not see that there is another way to see things, okay? And one of the ways that this happens is that we say people who are not within our industry can't understand the industry, okay? That's one thing that we do. I had this great interaction about 5 years ago. I was actually doing work in scenario planning, so not necessarily this topic, where I gave a talk, and someone came up to me and said, "Hey, John, I think we could really use your help here." And this was within the American auto industry, and I'd never done any work in the auto industry. And I worked through some conversations with a number of their executive team, and we initially came to an agreement that what they really needed was they needed help breaking out of the conventional mindset, strategically, of the American automobile industry. And after a little bit longer, then they concluded that I was not the right person to help them. I think we probably both concluded this at a certain point. But the main reason that I was not the right person to help them is that I had no experience in the auto industry. And I just found that to be a really fascinating argument. We need someone to help us see things outside of our industry, but we need to only talk to someone who's got 20 years of experience in our industry. And that's the type of thing that's kind of stuck with me to think about how do we balance that and how do we really assess the expertise we need for the problem we're trying to do. Okay? All right, so that's the second one. Now we're getting to the point, though, where I'm going to ask you to do a task for me. And we're going to move on a little bit to interpret. And the way we're going to do this, I'm going to ask you to do a task that I know some of you have done before, but that's all right. This is one of those tasks we can do multiple times. And this is where I need you to have a piece of paper in front of you. Okay? So everyone have a piece of paper and a pen in front of you to do this. I will tell you I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to do this task, which is my motivation to get you to actually do it. Because it turns out sitting by yourself for 3 minutes while the speaker's not speaking, it feels a lot longer than 3 minutes, okay, if you're not doing something. So just humor me to do this as a way to pass your time, okay? So here's what I want you to do. I'm going to give you 10 questions. And for these 10 questions, I want you to just give me 2 answers for each one of these questions. I want you to give me a range. I want you to, in particular, give me a 90% confidence range. So if you want to do it, you can sort of write a row 1 to 10 for your 10 questions, and then 2 answers where you are 90% confident the correct answer is within that range. It's important to recognize I'm looking for a range, okay? So, for example, any golfers here? Here. All right, fantastic. So a question could be, how many golf courses are there in the United States? I don't know. There's a lot. Let me guess that my best guess is 15,000, but I don't know. I'm going to say I'm 90% confident there's between 10,000 and 20,000. So for these questions, I want you to give me the 10,000 and 20,000. Okay? So here are your 10 questions. You can sit up here, sort of take a look at this. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to do this. And I have to say, this is an individual assignment. You guys are all nicely distributed for that. And no smartphones, okay, or iPads. All right, so we'll take 3 minutes. Give me a low number and a high number where you're 90% confident the correct answer is within the range for all of these questions. Okay. Now, I'm going to read off the answers to you, and all I want you to do is put a check next to those where the correct answer is within your range. So to start, date of Captain Cook's voyage, 1769. Length of the Nile River in miles, 4,163. Average gestation period of the female Asian elephant, 645 days. Population of South Africa in 2000, 38.5 million. Diameter of the moon in miles, 2,147. Year the Ming Dynasty began, 1368. Weight of an empty Boeing 747, 400 in pounds, 393,201. Year Orhan Pamuk won the Nobel Prize in Literature, 2006. Deepest known point in any ocean in miles, 6.8. Year of Mozart's birth, 1756. Okay, got it? Fantastic. See, I told you, you're going to remember something totally random from this last presentation. It's going to be one of these answers. Okay? Now, how many of you got 10 out of 10 within your range? Raise your hands high. Okay, we've got 1 over here. Okay, how many of you got 9 out of 10 within your range? All right, got someone over here, a couple people around here. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, none. All right, raise them high. All right. Okay, fantastic. All right, so first of all, how many should you have gotten right if you had aligned your ranges well with your knowledge here? So any guesses here? Basically 9, right? 9 out of 10, 90% confidence range, 10 independent questions. On average, we would expect 9 out of 10. Very rarely happens. Few of you did get 9 out of 10. So raise your hands again if you got 9 out of 10, right? Okay. Was it because you knew all the answers? Wide ranges. It's not that you just happen to be a pub trivia whiz. Okay, fantastic. And here's the interesting thing. I often ask that question, and especially if it's a large group of people who work with you. The person often kind of shrinks down a little when I ask that question because they're kind of embarrassed to say what you just said, which is, I said 1 to a million. And they're embarrassed to say that because it feels like they cheated with this. Now, I will tell you the average for this is about 3 out of 10. And that's actually what we find across the board. When you ask people for 90% confidence ranges, we tend to get 30% ranges. I just use this as a really quick illustration, though, of something called overconfidence. Overconfidence is perhaps the most studied of the decision biases out there. And overconfidence is, in my mind, the key for why we're very bad at interpreting the information that comes into us. And here's what I'll tell you about overconfidence. That is that we tend to not know what we don't know. And part of that is social, and part of that is cognitive. And this quick little exercise, I wanted to do this because, first of all, I could tell you about overconfidence, and you'll all nod your heads and say, yeah, you know, that's very familiar, John. Everyone I work with is overconfident. Okay. If you didn't get 9 out of 10, which is the majority of you in here, I just want to say, yeah, everyone you work with is overconfident. Maybe you too a little bit, okay? Because one of the things that we find is that overconfidence exists amongst experts just as much as it exists amongst non-experts. And from an organizational perspective, we care that experts are overconfident because we're going to them for information. It is in your area of expertise that people seek you out. And if you don't know what you don't know, that really becomes a problem. And here's what I can tell you. There have been hundreds of studies of overconfidence, and there have been a lot of different ways it's been measured. You can always debate the way it's measured. It's very hard to capture what a person thinks they know. However it is measured, we continue to find the same patterns, which is that there's a gap. And the gap is, I think I know this, I actually know this. And whatever we talk to you about, whether it's the area that you're an expert in or something like this, which is completely random facts, we find that gap exists. We find that gap with 17-year-olds, and we find that gap with 60-year-olds. We find it across cultures. We find it across industries. We find it across professions. The gap varies in different ways, but the key thing is it's there. The thing about overconfidence, though, is if I believe I know what I'm talking about, I don't look for alternatives, right? And I don't question the information that's out there. I told you there's a social side and there's a cognitive side. I can tell you that I increased the heart rate in this room by asking you to do this survey. Because one of the things that we found is that if someone asks you a question you don't know the answer to, even if you're not expected to know the answer to it, in that moment, you experience stress. So I could ask you a random question about the population of South Africa. Probably no one expects you to know that answer. But in that moment that I ask you that question and you discover you don't know the answer, your heartbeat increases. And you suddenly realize you're going to have to admit ignorance to something, even if it's something kind of random. Okay? And we don't like to do that. Here's the interesting thing about that, though, is that there's a really quick way to relieve your stress in that moment. And you know what it is? It's not saying I don't know. It's just giving an answer, any answer. And it reduces your stress. Saying I don't know kind of reduces your stress at sort of a slower speed there. So that suggests that we're hardwired to actually make something up rather than say I don't know, which indicates partially why this might be a problem, okay? The other thing about this is that we find that certain professions are better at this than others. Anyone want to guess what the most overconfident profession is? Okay, I've got different things here. Attorneys, psychologists, I got others. Politics, that often comes up a lot, and there's been some interesting studies there. It's all over the board, actually. But it's actually medical doctors. And I have to say, I did hear professor come out. Professors are very overconfident as well. But medical doctors consistently come out as the most overconfident. And that's not surprising. It's scary, but it's not surprising. If you think about why you go to a doctor, you go to a doctor for an answer. And if you don't get an answer, you're not satisfied. So they've got this social pressure to give an answer. On top of that, they tend to be at the top of a hierarchy. And that also, we know, leads to the pressure to give an answer. The good news is that a lot of this work was done in medical schools, and the way that doctors are trained now has really taken a lot of this into account. Some of you probably work in the medical profession. I work an awful lot with hospital systems and other people across the healthcare field, and I get this very commonly. I'm hearing people say, yeah, you know, people who have trained more recently, they don't suffer this quite as much because we train them more on overconfidence. But medical doctor, other side, which profession would you say is, they're not underconfident, but they actually are very well aligned with what they know? Any guesses? Okay, I got accountants, teachers. Actually, K through 12 teachers do very well in this. Like I said, professors, no, we're like doctors, okay? But the K through 12 teachers, pretty good. Accountants, I've seen accountants sort of in the middle in the studies I've seen here. It's actually people who deal with probabilities. Any profession that's all about ranges and probabilities. So actuaries do very well with this. Statisticians, not surprisingly. People who work in direct science. The one that I find most fascinating, though, is meteorologists, weather forecasters. And if you think about it, that the meteorologist is trained to never say we know the answer. That right from the beginning. Penn State has a very big meteorology department. I'm friends with one of the faculty members there, and he's confirmed this to me. They train their undergraduates to never say they know what's going to happen. It's all about, here's what our models tell us. We can tell you with this much probability that this is going to happen. I bring that up because if you think about that as a social pressure type setting, medical doctors have put themselves into a profession where there is pressure to say they know. Meteorologists, they're allowed to say they don't know and give ranges. I'm not here to say you should do that. We know that that's not a good persuasive technique to give away your power that way. But I would say, think about the field you're in. Think about your organization. Are you more like the medical doctor, you're expected to know an answer? Or are you more like the meteorologist and you're allowed to talk in terms of ranges? If you're like most of us, we fall more on the medical doctor side. That does not mean you're automatically overconfident. It just means you've put yourself into a setting that encourages overconfidence. Okay? One other final thing I'll leave you with on overconfidence, though, or actually a couple. One is, I want you to think about what's your red flag. And what I mean by that is, think about what it is that you are viewed as an expert in, and think about how you're keeping up that expertise. Because it has degraded. What we think of when we think of overconfidence is that, let's say 5-10 years ago, you were a world-class expert at something. You knew this much, and at that moment, you also knew you knew that much. Over the last 5 to 10 years, what's happened? Well, you've been managing with various things outside of work. You've been spending time with vacation schedules, budgets, whatever. Your expertise has gone down. You know that. So your knowledge of your expertise has gone down as well, but it's gone down slower. And so what happens is that what we find out with experts, perception of your expertise goes down at a slower rate than your actual expertise, okay? And there tends to be this gap that opens up there. If you accept that, then all you have to do is think about what are you doing to close that gap and keep your knowledge at where you think it is anyway, okay? So next time someone comes to you and asks you a question in something that you're an expert in, give them an answer, and then think to yourself, what am I doing to maintain this expertise? And it could be as simple as going to a conference every 2 years, reading a trade journal once a month, just scanning the headlines, something so that you know where the world is going. In 2003, I wrote an article on something called transactive memory. It was published in the Journal of Applied Psychology, which is a well-known psychology journal. At that moment, I could say I was probably one of 4 people who knew anything about this little area called transactive memory, which is how knowledge moves in teams. The interesting thing is I was a one-hit wonder on transactive memory. I didn't really have much interest in it, but at that moment, everyone identified me as an expert. And so I've used that as my red flag, because once a month, a graduate student emails me and asks me, hey, what's going on with transactive memory? And this year it's become hot again, I guess, because I'm getting a lot more emails. And I use that as sort of I don't really know. And it's easy now because I know I don't know. But I now, every time I get one of those emails, I sit back and say, what is the project I'm working on right now where I'm viewed as an expert? And what am I doing to maintain that expertise? So if I'm working in the energy industry, the pharmaceutical industry, what is it that I should be doing to maintain this expertise that I have? Okay? So I want you to think about perhaps doing that for yourself. And one other thing, you might say, hey, John, if that's great, but what if I just ask people how confident they are in their answer? Well, there's a problem with this as well. So as a leader, you have to assess how much other people know. So you don't just get an answer from them, you have to also get, how much they know. So I could say, well, how confident are you in your answer? This is a sentence that's been used in numerous social psychology experiments, and it's really quite simple. You usually flash it up to people and you say, count the number of F's in this sentence. Okay, so we do that. And the actual answer is there are 6 F's, and what people miss is usually the of, because you don't need it to read the sentence, and the one in scientific, because you've stopped reading that word before the end of it and moved on to the other word. But okay, so let's say I say 6, and I'm 95% confident. Those are the 2 questions that were asked in this study. Here's what was interesting about this. For those people who answered 6 got the right answer, they said they were 95% confident they got the right answer. For those people who got the wrong answer, they said they were 95% confident they got the right answer. So the moral of this is that you can't just ask people how confident they are, because it turns out we're not very good at knowing how confident we are. You have to go deeper than this. And the question that we like to ask people is, basically the logic. How did you come to your decision? Then you as a leader can start to understand where that knowledge comes from. There's an even better question to ask, though, to get beyond overconfidence. And that is, what would prove me wrong? And just asking that question is a great way to sort of get this conversation going. So the punchline of this is that we can't say we're good at bringing data in until we confront this idea of overconfidence, okay? And this idea of and just being aware that it's something that all of us struggle with, and we struggle with it more as others view us as experts, because it's sort of some of our identity comes from knowing the answer at that point. One final thing about this, and then I'm going to move on to our next challenge here. That is, there's another decision bias that feeds off of overconfidence that makes it increasingly difficult for leaders to deal with. And to give you this, let me just give you a little bit of my background here. I'm going to ask you just a quick question here. When I was in college, I played on a sports team. So I'm just curious to know, what sports team do you think I played on? And I know for those of you in the back, it's hard to get perception right. So I'm about 6'2", 220 or so. Okay. So, all right. So just shout it out. What do you think I played on? What team? Okay, I get tennis, baseball, soccer, lacrosse. Okay, basketball. Yeah, you got the 6'2". Thanks. Okay. Did someone say chess? All right, I always get chess. If there's more than 100 people in the room, I get chess. All right, so here's the thing about that. You don't know. Some of you, I don't know if there's some random person in the room actually knows. But for the most part, you just made an educated guess. There's nothing wrong with that. You have to do that all the time. As a leader, we actually have to make decisions on incomplete information. And you took what little you know about me, you combined it with some mental model you have of athletes. Or whoever said lacrosse, that might be because you know something that Hopkins has a lacrosse team and maybe something with that. And then you make an educated guess. That's fine, as long as you recognize it's a guess. Here's where it gets interesting. If I give you 10 minutes to think about your guess, you will come back and be more confident that your guess is right, even though I tell you no more about myself. There has actually been a study where people were randomly assigned their answers, given 10 minutes to think about it, and those people came back and argued far more passionately for that randomly assigned position than other people who didn't have that time or were distracted during that time. This suggests that what we do is we use that time to rationalize the initial guess, instead of using that time to think about the pros and cons of this. And if you think about how strategy and strategic thinking plays out in organizations, we often get a group of people together. We ask them to, resolve this issue, collect some information, and come up with options. Through that process, there is always a moment where one person in the group says, hey, you know what? This is just an initial hypothesis, an initial idea, just something to think about, and then they give an idea. They give an option. It always happens in any group. And they may even say something like, I know we're not to the stage where we're generating options, but I just want to put this out there as an option so I don't forget it. You might hear that quite a bit as a facilitator. At that moment, something subtle happens. You all break, you go away for a week, and you come back, and an interesting thing is you all start saying, hey, you know, Jim's idea there, I saw this about that. It looks like that would be a great idea. And someone else shouts out and says, yeah, you know what, I got this information. It suggests that also might be a great idea. And it turns out that that initial hypothesis looks brilliant because for the last week, everyone has been looking for information that suggests it's a good idea. And you don't even notice you're doing it, okay? So we have to challenge this and think about if I am overconfident and I think I know more than I actually know, and then I look for evidence I'm right, you can see why this becomes a big challenge. And so we find that for strategic leaders, one of the big things that they actively do is they look for multiple sources of information, and they use that question, what would prove us wrong, as a driving question in a decision process, because that counteracts the overconfidence. People get very upset if I don't tell them what sport I played. That's all they'll remember if I don't say it. So I was a wrestler, okay? So no one ever guesses it, why it's such a great thing to use here. So I was the heavyweight. Actually, I should say I was in the weight class that the NCAA no longer has. That's true. They don't make adults my size anymore, apparently. Thanks to modern nutrition, I guess. So moving on from interpret, let me just recap where we've been here. Really, at this point, to anticipate the biggest challenge is tunnel vision. And the way we counteract that is we look for unconventional sources of information. For challenging, the biggest problem is we don't even recognize there are different ways to see the question we're working on. So the way that we counteract that is that we look for people who would see the world differently and engage them in the process. For interpreting, our big challenge is overconfidence. And because of overconfidence, we don't look for multiple sources of information. And the best way to counteract that is to look for evidence that you're wrong. Okay? Where are we at now? Let's talk about decide. Well, with decide, I'm going to go back to a nice old example. And this is a question that was asked by Amos Tversky, who is Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in Economics for their work showing that we are predictably irrational. A great way to win the Nobel Prize in Economics. One of the most rational Nobel Prizes out there, I think. This was one of the studies that Amos Tversky did. He said, imagine you're in college and you're given the following survey. What would you rather do tonight? Go to the library and study? Or go to a lecture by an author you admire who's only visiting today. So an option is something I can do any night or something I can only do tonight. This is pre-internet. This author's not on YouTube. Okay? And it won't surprise you to know that about 80% of the people will say, I'm going to go do the thing I can only do tonight. Then he asked this question to another group, but he added another option. And the third option was same two first options. And then also, watch a film you've wanted to see that is only on campus tonight. So all we've done is we've added a second option that you can only do tonight. Okay, now by adding that second option now, 40% of the students are just going to go to the library and study. So by giving them another thing that they can only do tonight, we've doubled the number of people who are just going to go, I don't know. I'm just going to study. Okay, I love this example. If you've ever been with a group, maybe in the last couple nights you've been with a group of friends. Say, where are we going to go out to eat? When one person comes up with an idea, it's great. When a second person comes up with an idea, it's great. When that third person comes up with an idea, it's not so great anymore. We've become paralyzed. We don't know what to do. And this is our big challenge with decide, is that we always say we need multiple good options. But if you add options to a decision, but you don't have a process for how you decide between the options, it will just paralyze you. And so it's not enough to just say good decision makers generate multiple options. Good decision makers start with a criteria of how they're going to determine between the options before they even start generating the options, right? You probably remember this from a undergraduate decision-making class. The other part of that makes things very difficult when it comes to deciding, though, is that there is this is the stage when you're talking about strategic decisions, it's not just one person. It's actually multiple people. And so all of the challenges of group decision making come into play here as well. In fact, this is one area when I've worked with different HR groups where we found the most strength when we score on strategic assessments, aptitude, sort of around these decisions. The part of deciding that has to do with group decision making, HR professionals are far better than most executives because a lot of people have the training in facilitating groups. And that's a training that a lot of executives don't get, quite to the level they ought to get it, okay? And so we find that as something that if you're good at that, you have that process, it goes a long way. And so there's a lot of different techniques out there. As a facilitator, I like the idea of having something very quick and memorable for how you move a group through the decision process and how that works. So I just use the GSO framework, which is generate, synthesize, and own. And there's multiple techniques for all of those things, right? For how do we generate lots of ideas, how do we synthesize them, and then how do we make sure there's ownership going forward with that. So decide the big problem, decision paralysis. We need a process to get beyond decision paralysis. Okay, now let's move on to align. Remember, align is about how it is that we can now make sure that we bring others on board. And I'd like to use a story off of sort of an old story that highlights one of the things that makes this difficult, but then also, at the same time, what's the technique that can get you out of that difficulty. So with aligning, this is where all of our conversation about stakeholders comes into play. And we find that strategic leaders are very good at bringing the right people into the conversation. And so I'm going to start with the story of Jackie Robinson. Actually, I'm not going to tell you the story of Jackie Robinson. There's plenty of places to learn that. But instead, I'm going to back it up a little bit to the beginning of this story, to a particular element that was set up that enabled Jackie Robinson to start for the Brooklyn Dodgers. So just to give you a sense, Jackie Robinson on April 15th, 1947, he started for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Don't have to know anything about baseball for this, okay? Just if you recognize the name Jackie Robinson, it tells you that there was something big here. He was the first black ball player to play Major League Baseball in the modern era. For Major League Baseball. He went on to a Hall of Fame career, was very successful, and became a spokesperson for many issues outside of baseball, and also this process inspired a lot of other organizations to work towards desegregation. I'm going to back this up just a little bit, though. I'm going to talk a little bit about Branch Rickey. Now, Branch Rickey was the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers. How many of you saw the movie 42? Okay, so this is Harrison Ford. It looks like him, right? So Branch Rickey started as Brooklyn Dodger general manager in 1942. And for personal and professional reasons, he had decided that he was going to be the person to desegregate Major League Baseball. It was something he was committed to bringing the first black ball player into the Brooklyn Dodgers. Now, imagine that you are trying to do something as audacious as this in the 40s. No one expects you to do this. It's not even viewed as a legitimate thing to do. And yet he set out to do this. So the first thing he needed to do is identify who are the key people that I need to influence around this. Interestingly enough, in 1944, Branch Rickey did a stakeholder analysis. He wouldn't call it that, of course, because that term wasn't in existence. But what he did is he sat down with a sociologist from New York University, and the two of them identified who are the key people and groups that they needed to have an argument for and they needed to persuade, and that they would not act on anything until they knew exactly how they were going to approach those groups and what they were going to say. So some of you may be familiar with this idea of a stakeholder map. We have found that this is probably one of the most valuable tools out there for looking at how we successfully align around these things. So this is the more sort of common one out there. There's multiple ways to sort stakeholders. This is where we just sort them by interest and power. So your high power, high interest stakeholders, those are the ones that should automatically come to our mind. Then we have our low power, low interest. That's just to keep us aware that there's a larger group out there. They're not interested in this issue right now, but we need to keep monitoring this because that's where future stakeholders may come from. And of course, our very intriguing ones are the high power, low interest. They don't care about my issue, but they could block it if they did care. So you work for more than one person. You're doing a project for this boss over here. This one doesn't care about the project, but they care about your time. And if this project starts to take up more of your time, suddenly this boss over here might take an interest in your project. And then to keep informed, people who are lower power but have lots of information. They may be the people that are closest to your customers. They may be the people responsible for executing and implementing on something, any of these types of things. Okay, so this is familiar. You've probably seen this type of idea before. Let's just think for a second. If Branch Rickey calls you up and says, hey, come back in time and help me with my stakeholder work, who are some of the stakeholder groups that you would think, absolutely, knowing nothing about baseball, who comes to mind? Fans, Dodger players, others? The owners of the Dodgers, the media, okay, the press. Okay, any others? The coach, okay, yep. Players on other teams, you can start generating a whole list of other things. The Brooklyn community, the African American community, any of these, you can start to generate this list, right? They actually did this, and they came up with this list, and there was the interesting thing about this, and this is what I want to drive home about this, is that we often talk about doing stakeholder mapping, and it's often done after a decision has been made, but before it's executed. It's often connected in with project management work, and it's done at the start of the execution phase. I'm going to argue that you should do some form of stakeholder mapping before you make your decision. It doesn't have to be that deep, but it's basically your way to make sure you have the right people on board to make the decision. And you also potentially avoid traps. And I use this illustration because one of the stakeholders that Branch Rickey identified was the Commissioner of Baseball. And the Commissioner of Baseball was a man named Kennesaw Mountain Landis. He'd been the Commissioner of Baseball since 1919. He had been a federal judge before that, so that tells you he's up there in age. He also is someone who is very passionately and aggressively against the idea of desegregation. And Rickey and him hate each other personally. Okay, so all of these things set up to mean that this is a stakeholder that's going to be very hard to get around. The other thing is that the Commissioner of Baseball has the right to kick any player off a team without the owner's consent. And he's used this frequently. So you could spend all of your time thinking about what you're going to do to convince this commissioner to support this, because without commissioner's support, there's no way that this is going to happen. And in fact, other people who tried to desegregate baseball had done this. And on every occasion, Commissioner Landis blocked those attempts. So what actually happened here? Well, I'm not going to ask you to be a baseball historian here. What actually happened is that I told you that he's probably in his late 70s, Rickey's in his early 60s, and he actually thought he could outlast Landis. And that's in fact what happened. In November of 1944, Commissioner Landis died. It is no coincidence that this initiative moved rapidly forward over the next 6 months. So he was replaced by a man named Happy Chandler, and even the nickname tells you this is going to be a better setting here. And in fact, Chandler was very glad to go along with it. And in fact, Rickey visited him a few weeks after he came into office and told him he was going to sign a black ball player, and Chandler was glad to go along with this and to support this. And he did a number of things over the next few years as commissioner that really did push this forward. The message here, though, really is that by doing this and doing the stakeholder work early, you didn't fall into one of those traps. And I would say it is overconfidence which leads you to think you can convince any stakeholder. As someone who works in the leading change field, I come across a lot of change consultants who argue that if you can identify your stakeholders, you can persuade every stakeholder. And I would argue that that's overconfidence. That in fact, part of the reason you do stakeholder analysis is there are some stakeholders that you cannot persuade. And by doing it early, you perhaps can discuss the difficult conversation about whether or not this is an appropriate initiative to do right now. Because it's not going to happen if that person is still in the way. Okay? All right, so that gets us through a line. The big thing is thinking about who your stakeholders are and to doing it early. And then finally, the last one is learn. When we think about learn, it's fail fast, fail cheap, fail often, I just add and do this visibly. One of the interesting things about organizations is that most people will agree that organizational success is the result of previous organizational failure. It's the rare organization that succeeds without some initial failure in their history. And yet so few organizations actually reward the individual who made that failure. So that's this disconnect that we have to work with. How is it that we can recognize that sometimes when our managers and employees fail, it's actually very good for our organization. They did everything they could to teach us that that's not the right thing to do. And so can we actually figure out how to reward those people? And I don't have to tell this group that the problem with this is equity, and that we have to think about that as well, and how it is that we reward people appropriately. But then also, there's this bizarre idea that if you reward failure, then that other people are going to look at that and say, oh, well, I don't have to succeed then. And of course, the idea here is to think about how we reward good process as opposed to just rewarding good outcomes. And I open that up for you as sort of one of your big challenges to work with as you work through this. And then think about what's the last time that you had a senior executive stand in front of a group of people in your organization and tell you the story of how they failed at something. And how powerful that can be if you can get someone to do that. Because then the message is, hey, and look where I am right now. And we need you to experiment. We need you to work at this, right? The other part of this, though, is that it's kind of odd. It feels odd to do this. So is there a smaller step that you can take? One of those steps is to explore outside of the organization to learn from other failures. Engineers Without Borders is a great example of this. They actually have a website called admittingfailure.com, where these are engineers who work within NGOs. So they actually publicly put out there their failures, so that in hopes that other NGOs and other engineers won't make the same mistakes. It's kind of a good way to start to give you some ideas on how something like this could happen. The other thing to keep in mind when it comes to learning, though, is that this is easy to say, hard to do. And part of it that we find is that people want to learn from their decisions, but they just don't have time. Right? So you move on to new decisions here. So you all probably are familiar with the idea of after-action reviews. What we find that strategic leaders do is that they do these short after-action reviews as well. So after the small decisions, after the quick check-ins. The U.S. military refers to this as the hot wash, this idea of sort of a very quick questioning of what went well, what would we do differently. And to do that while it's still in everyone's mind, is really a great technique. The big challenge, though, we find is that oftentimes it's useful to add that to the beginning of a project rather than the end of a project. We often do it as the closeout of a project, when really we need that insight at the beginning of the next project, so that's another good time to talk about the last project. Okay? One final point about this before I bring this all together, though, and that is each one of these has these questions that we like to ask people. What would prove us wrong? What is the unconventional information that we should be looking at? How would someone else see this differently? I just want to remind you, though, something that I know other speakers have talked about here as well, which is that all inquiry is not created equal, and to think about how you find the right people to ask your questions. And something that feeds all through the way we think about strategic leadership is being very mindful about thinking through the questions you ask, but also the people that you ask those questions to, right? And I'll give you just one way that I learned this early. When I was in college, I was a lifeguard at a national park, at Acadia National Park in Maine. Any of you ever been to Acadia National Park? Beautiful park. I was the lifeguard at Sand Beach, which is a nice ocean beach, very short, a quarter-mile long. Best summer job ever, because it's Maine. No one swims in Maine, you know? So best summer job for a college student. I just sat there on the beach and answered questions. And there were two questions that I got multiple times in any given summer. The first question, is that a whale? Well, there was this rock out there that when the tide was right, it looked just like a whale. And to me, well, first of all, I always knew it. I could look at and up on the stairs, there'd be all the binoculars trained on that. And so I knew that all these people were excitedly looking at the whale. And I'd leave them alone, because it's exciting to see a whale, and I didn't want to ruin that part of their vacation. But if they asked me, I would say, no, it's a rock. That to me is a good question. And when someone comes up to the lifeguard and asks them that question, that's good inquiry. I've never seen something like that. Who around here might have the knowledge of what that is? And I will go ask them that question. That's good inquiry, right? The other question, how high above sea level are we? I got that multiple times. And it's odd, right? It's the ocean. It's the beach right there. So in some ways it makes sense. If you've ever been to Acadia, you hike all the mountains and there's a sign that sort of tells you how high you are. And so you start to think about this as part of, especially with your family, everyone starts to care in some ways. And I think it was easy. But however, that's a bad question, okay? That's a stupid question. I think no stupid question. I actually kind of think maybe that one is. And the point here about that is why I think that's bad inquiry, not just that it's funny, but it's that you're not actually being mindful. You're not stepping back for a moment and assessing the situation before you seek out information. And I want to leave you with that idea of part of what we think about is for all 6 of these steps, it's being mindful about this that we see stands out. And it's recognizing what those gaps are and where those gaps come from. And so to close this out, I want to leave you with 6 things to think about. One for each one of these elements. And hopefully one of them is something that you can start processing. I started you off by telling you we know that strategic leaders do all behaviors in all 6 of these dimensions. So think about which of these dimensions leaders at your organization seem to be weak in. And just think to yourself, what can you do in your role to help them develop that capability? Each one of these skills is something that has deep training that people can dig into, right? To sort of develop it in different ways. So with anticipate, seek out those unconventional sources. Look for that. And look for the weak signals. I will tell you what's not a weak signal, based on all these different conferences I've been hitting at, that millennials are entering the workforce. No one can get away from that conversation, it seems, and not just in the HR world, okay? That's no longer a weak signal, okay? So we need to think about what is the weak signal that sort of is at the edge of what we're working on. Challenge, ask yourself how different stakeholders would see the problem differently. Remember those cards. Remember that idea of do you automatically see what your experience tells you is there, or is there something else that can help me see it differently? Interpret. Search for information that would prove your theory wrong. If you did not get 9 out of 10, remind yourself, we all struggle with overconfidence, and as your expertise increases, the risk to your organization of your overconfidence becomes really kind of a big, crucial risk. With decide, commit to generating multiple options. With align, build a stakeholder map. This is something that you can do on the way into work. While you're commuting, you have a big conversation in front of you. Think early, all right, who are the stakeholders? And I'll give you one shorthand thing as a change facilitator that I've discovered over the years. If you ask 2 questions, the first is the simple one, who are the high power, high interest stakeholders? And you generate that list. Those are the people that you were going to remember anyway without the stakeholder work. If the second question you ask are who are the high power, low interest stakeholders, inevitably you end up adding more to the high power, high interest stakeholder list, that you start remembering the stakeholders you almost missed if you ask the question about how high power, low interest. So just a sort of a small thing that I've learned over the years doing that. And then with learn, commit to a candid conversation about a past blind spot with your team. The thing we've learned about how to create a learning culture is, while there's so much about that, it is if the leader shows vulnerability in the willingness to talk about mistakes, that's what opens it up for that entire team of people that work with that leader, okay? So I thank you for your time. I thank you for closing this out with me. I know it's kind of interesting when you have this large hall with people way back there, but mostly what I see are empty seats. So it's kind of interesting. I'm glad that you stuck with this and engaged with this. And the 300 or 400 of you that have been here, remember, you're going to tell everyone else it's the best thing ever. It doesn't matter if it was true or not. You're just going to, let them know they missed something. But anyway, thank you for your time. Okay?